Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation, or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is Chris Dombrowski. Chris is an author, poet, and fishing guide who lives and works in Missoula, Montana. As a writer, Chris is probably best known for his book, Body of Water, A Sage, a Seeker, and the World's Most Elusive Fish, which is one of the best books that I've read in years. He's also published several collections of poetry, and his newest volume, titled Ragged Anthem, will be released this week. When you merge Chris's decades of experience in the outdoors with his phenomenal skills as a wordsmith and creative, the end product is some of the most engaging writing that any outdoor lover could ever hope to read. Chris grew up in Michigan and was always drawn to fishing, hunting, and outdoor adventure. During high school, his favorite English teacher gave him a copy of A River Runs Through It. He devoured the book in a day, and from that point forward, he knew he wanted to be a professional writer living in the American West. Over the following years, he began fish guiding in Montana, attended graduate school in Missoula, and built a solid career as a working writer and poet. Along the way, he established friendships with such notable Western writers as Jim Harrison and David James Duncan, and he also established his nonprofit writing workshop, the Beargrass Writing Retreat. If you're interested in creativity, writing, or the writing process, then you will absolutely love this episode with Chris. We talk about that fateful day when he read A River Runs Through It and exactly how that moment changed his life. We talk about his work as a teacher and a guide and how those skills inform his writing. We also talk about his writing process and his writing studio, the importance of creating art with a disciplined, workmanlike approach, and how he deals with any self-doubt that may come when publishing his work. We chat in depth about poetry, and Chris offers some great advice for poetry novices like me who want to better understand the art form. We talk about specific writers Chris particularly admires, including John McPhee, Thomas McGuane, David James Duncan, Jim Harrison, and more. Chris also offers a ton of excellent book recommendations, discusses his favorite rivers in Montana, and offers some excellent words of wisdom for those who love the West. Thanks again to Chris for this fun conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. When you meet somebody for the first time and they ask you that question, what do you do? How do you answer that?
More and more, I feel fortunate to be able to answer that question with, I'm a writer, you know.
Yep.
I used to do a lot of teaching, and I've always, for the past 20 years, I've guided fishing trips. And so a lot of times I used to say, well, I teach this part of the year, and I write part of the year, and then I fish guide for the other part of the year. And people would always look at me like just with a kind of dazed or confused look on their face, you know, like A, how on earth could you parlay all those things? And B, why would you attempt to do it? So more and more nowadays, I say I'm a writer. You know, I guide fishing trips in the summer, June through October. But even so, that's fudging it a little bit because I direct this nonprofit writers workshop in town, and as you know, you're probably a father and a spouse, partner, first and foremost. So it's never, for me at least, it's never been a simple answer. But I find more and more in all of my work that the disparate threads are becoming more and more braided. You know?
Yep.
And that's a satisfying feeling. You know, I'm sure we'll talk a good bit about Body of Water, but for me, that was a book that I avoided writing for a long time. What I mean is I tried not to write about fishing, despite the fact that, I'd fished my entire life and guided for most of my adult life. But other than writing freelance articles, I really wanted to avoid writing a book about fishing. So that book was a little bit of a, I kind of reconciled that desire to not write about fishing in such a way. I guess what I mean is I had to face the music a little bit and say, all right, you have these a fragmented life. That's not so good. So let's try to patch it together and see what kind of quilt we can make,
Well, damn, I'm glad that you came to that conclusion, because that book was unbelievable. And I just kind of happened across it. I heard you on Steve Rinella's podcast. I was like, that guy seems super cool. And then the book sounded so awesome. And so I immediately ordered it. And I mean, it was one of the best books that I can remember reading in a long time. And I'm not like going overboard kissing your ass. I mean, that is 100% true. And I just couldn't believe how awesome that was. And I think everybody needs to read it. Whether you're interested in fishing or the Bahamas or any of that, it's really amazing. So let's just talk a little bit about that. I mean, how did you decide, or when did you decide, like, all right, there's a book here, I need to write a book about this?
That's an awesome question. And like many things in my life, the obvious has been easy to avoid,
Yeah.
And so I really had when I first went down to the Bahamas, it was just as a gift from a friend, a real good friend and client who wanted to drag me along to a place he'd spent much of his angling life at the east end of Grand Bahama, called Deepwater Key. And so he said, you got to come along. And on that first trip, I was fortunate enough to meet a man named David Pinder Sr., who was the first Bahamian bonefish guide. He went to work in the late 60s for $5 a day, and in an industry that is now basically the crux of the Bahamian economy, to the tune of $150 million a year. So, and so Miller, my friend, and another really wonderful guy, friend of mine from Baltimore, said, "You realize that you've met this man who was the cornerstone or the taproot of an industry, and you guys kind of made a connection here. Do you think you could kind of plumb this for research? Maybe there's a book here, etc." And I was still what I would call a poetry purist at that point. I was writing some nonfiction. I had written some nonfiction articles, freelance pieces that maybe delved fishing and the outdoors a little bit, but I was really trying to keep that world separate from my practice of poetry. I don't know. I can't really answer that question for you. Why did I establish that as a rule so early on? I have no idea, but I did. So I went back down to the Bahamas, and I was there under the auspices of writing like a where to piece for Outside magazine, and I met Senior. David Pinder is referred to in the book as Senior. I met Senior again, and I thought, God, this guy is kind of a singular human being, in the sense that he has spent so much of his life, all of it really, on one 2-mile island at the end of the archipelago. Mm-hmm. And I started to think back on my favorite books about the natural world, and one of them is a book you may know. It's called The Meadow by James Galvin.
Oh yeah. Nobody's ever mentioned that on this podcast, but that is a unbelievable book, and it's got a poetic tone to it. I can understand why you'd love that so much.
Sure, well, right. And Galvin is a poet. He teaches at University of Iowa. He's happens to be a real dear friend of mine, and I started to think about the character in that book, Lyle, that mm-hmm. gentleman who spends his whole life up on the mountain. And I started to think of Senior in that way. And that was probably the first inkling that I had as to how I might go about constructing a book around this person's life. Then I wrote about 125 pages and was pretty much ready to throw them away. I had a couple of agents interested in another nonfiction book proposal that I ultimately jettisoned, but neither one of those agents was interested in, at the time anyway, a book about a Bahamian hermit who had started an industry around, the pursuit of a small, virtually inedible game fish, and surprise, but I sent those 125 pages to a real dear friend of mine, a novelist named David James Duncan, who probably everybody in the West knows for his book, The River Wye, and the novel, The Brothers K. And David was good enough to say, hey, this isn't a book or even half of a book, but there's some good writing here, so don't throw it away. And then I was lucky enough for it to fall into the hands of a couple editors at Milkweed Editions. That's my dog you hear groaning at me.
Oh, go for it, man. That's standard on this podcast. We've had so many dogs barking. That's what we want.
Okay, good. So I had a good friend at Orion Magazine, the CEO there, Chip Blake, and I kind of queried him and said, do you have any idea what I should do with this? And he said, send it to Patrick Thomas, who was then at Milkweed. And Patrick essentially perked up right away and said, I think what you have here is basically the bones of a book, and I could really see I'd love to work with you on it, basically. And what he did then was he really teased out all of the elements. I've used this example a number of times, but he would say, here you have a sentence about the economic impact of the bonefish. It needs to be a 30-page chapter, Uh-huh. So, or here you have a paragraph about how the geologic construction of the islands create this freshwater lens that then allow the bonefish to, the mangroves to grow and the bonefish to flourish, and it needs to be a chapter, and so on and so forth. So, your question was, how early on did I know? I'd say about after 2 years of fiddling around with it.
That's what I think a lot of people don't understand, and I'm still learning, is just how long the process of people writing these books, how long it can take from the initial idea to really getting going on it. This is kind of a random question, but I was thinking about it. So, you're obviously a very skilled and experienced poet, and then you write nonfiction. And so in poetry, I would guess, and I don't know hardly anything about poetry, but I would right. guess, you're focused on not only every word, but every syllable. I mean, just the mm-hmm. most minute, down to the smallest detail of every aspect of it. And so you could work on a sentence for weeks, I would guess. And then you go to having to crank out whatever, like 80,000 words. Right. And so how do you balance that in your head as an author? I mean, because I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would think it would be real easy to get real bogged down given your almost obsession with words.
That's an awesome question, Ed. You're right. You can't. I think it was Baudelaire said, in poetry there are no matters of minutia. Yeah. So yeah. If you take that same approach to the construction of a prose book, it can be maddening. I'm working on my second book of nonfiction now, and I found myself yesterday editing a chapter, and I was like, man, I've edited this sentence 15 times in the last 3 weeks. This is ridiculous. It's time to move on. And that doesn't mean that I don't think, an artist, the novelist James Salter, who spent a lot of time in Colorado, he had a great line. He said, the secret of making a good book is simple. Discard anything that was good enough. So you never want to just say, okay, that's good enough. But mm-hmm. at some point during the editing, you have to move on and say, someone needs to help me with this. Another great little tidbit I got, again, from this novelist friend of mine was that when you're constructing a book made of prose, there must be some level sense of the density of each sentence, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the density of a sentence from Cormac McCarthy is totally different from the density of a sentence from Louise Erdrich or Jim Harrison, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the consistency throughout the book is there. And what his comment was early on in Body of Water was, you know, if your sentences are logs that you're throwing on the fire, this one is burning at a different length of time than the next. You can't throw in something that's just full of pitch and knots, because it's gonna burn differently.
Sure.
You know, and the reader's gonna come upon it and say, it's not quite right. So that was a big challenge for me. Also, you know, as far as converting the poetic brain to the nonfiction brain, you know, poets are associative. They're certainly not linear. Mm-hmm. And I think nonfiction, for the most part, demands a little bit of sense of linearity. You know, you can skip around a good bit, but lyric association is not necessarily the easiest thing to pull off in nonfiction. You know, John McPhee has actually a great book called Draft Number 4.
Yeah, I've read that.
Yeah, and I was, you know, probably one of the coolest things that happened to me after Body of Water came out was to see this review that John Gierach gave it in the Wall Street Journal, because I'd never met Gierach, and I'd read his books since I was 18, you know, 16, yeah. Really, I'd read them all. And he talked a little bit about John McPhee's construction of his books. And I went, when Draft Number 4 came out, I went and read it, and I said, son of a gun, you know, there's a lot to be said. McPhee basically lines out for listeners his formula for, or model, would you call it, for telling a story in a non-linear fashion that accomplishes some more comprehensive narrative than otherwise would be accomplished via straight head narrative. Is that fair?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's like reading I thought of it more as reading like an engineering handbook than reading a book about how to write. I mean, there are graphs in the thing, and there are charts about, and you know, like he talks about it, the Archdruid book, and you know, I read that and I loved it. But when you see what he put into that, just like mapping it out before he even started writing, it's unbelievable.
Right. And the fact that he actually comprehended that what he was doing was the most kind of amazing thing to me. It's a great book for anybody who is looking to create a work of nonfiction, but also people who just read and want to engage with maybe more complex narratives. You know, it's really fascinating. I thought it was a tough book to get through, but a really, really rewarding one.
When did teaching come into your life? When did you decide? Because I can tell just by the way you explain this stuff, it makes sense to me, who is not an accomplished writer. I mean, I admire writing so much, and I admire writers so much, but I'm not a writer. But the way you explain all this makes perfect sense to me. So when did teaching come in? Well,
you know, back to your first question. As a guide, you're always teaching, right?
Yep.
So that was probably my first real exposure to teaching, was guiding, and even before guiding, trying to teach my dad to fly fish. My father grew up in Detroit, and he was not a fisherman, but I wanted him along some of the time, and so I had to, you know, teach him or teach friends or teach girlfriends. I had an amazing high school teacher, a man named Jim Calando in East Lansing High School in the middle of Michigan, who to whom I felt like I owed some debt, you know. So he was the reason I became a writer, and I thought, well, I'll be a high school teacher, you know, I'll be a high school English teacher. And my first assignment, my student teaching assignment, was in inner city Chicago at public school called Kenwood Academy. And I had a wonderful kind of what they would call a host teacher or guest teacher, a woman named Miss Lacey. And she said, look, the only way you're going to learn anything is if I throw you into the fire. So, you know, I'm going to stand here with you for a week and make sure there's no revolution against you. But after that, you're on your own. And so that was my first teaching experience. And I pretty much decided at that point that, you know, anyone who teaches public school, let alone in, you know, the inner city and impoverished neighborhoods, deserves some level of sainthood. But I also started reading seriously then too. You know, I'd started reading in high school, but what I mean by reading seriously is reading books that I thought would help me learn how to construct my own writing further on down the road. You know, not reading books that had been assigned in college or something like that. So, ironically, I was reading The Meadow then by James Galvin on the subway and on the, on the public transit in and out of Chicago every day. I lived kind of on the north side, but I pretty much figured out then that it would be really hard to be a full-time teacher and have a writing life.
Sure.
So after that, I kept guiding, and then I ended up in grad school at the University of Montana, and I was lucky enough to be awarded a poetry fellowship. So I got to teach again, and that really rekindled my love for teaching, and I've kept on with it. I still teach occasionally. I was the William Kittredge Distinguished Writer in Residence a couple years ago at the U of M. I teach through our Beargrass workshops, but now really I feel like this Beargrass Writing Conference that I host each year up at the Ebarl Ranch in Greeno, Montana.
And that's for people listening. That's Juanita Vero's ranch, who I had on the podcast a while back, and she's a badass. Go listen to that episode.
Juan is the greatest, and everyone up there is fantastic to put up with us. But we can talk about that later. But now the folks, the writers, the distinguished guests who come up there to speak and talk and read I love to think of them as just walking texts. You know, our classroom happens to be this immaculate 8,000 acre ranch with working horses and the Blackfoot running through it, and all kinds of critters and such. So, I think for a long time I thought that teaching had no bearing on one's ability to write. Meaning, you can be a real good fisherman and a horrible fishing guide, or you can be a real good fishing guide and a decent angler, right? And I never come away from like a kick-ass lesson or a class, like a workshop or a lecture, and feel like, awesome, man, I'm ready to go write some more. You know, it's always just the same level of exhaustion I might feel after working a 8-hour day at the desk, you know?
Sure.
So for a long time, I didn't necessarily feel that there was any coherence there. But what I do feel now is that whether I'm behind the oars or at the desk writing or teaching, there is some level of communication that has to take place. What I see in my head, what I envision, has to be communicated, transmitted, to the listener or to the angler or to the reader. And so, that's a realization that's taken me a long time to come to terms with. Like I said earlier, for many years I felt some level of disconnect with all those disparate parts, and now I'm like, okay, I'm the same dude, just different venue.
It's funny because we were talking before we started recording about how old we are and how we can't believe we're in our early 40s. We're about the same age, but looking back, I always felt like I kind of knew what was going on, and I had these very serious opinions about things and thought I kind of had it all figured out. And maybe this is what I'm getting ready to say is just another case of that. But I feel like now that, like, when I hit 40, it all kind of finally came together a little bit, and I could look back and kind of laugh at my old self. But
Right.
it's weird how just in the last few years, I feel like all the different moving pieces from all these different parts of my life have all kind of consolidated to where they're supposed to be, which is
Right.
kind of a unique feeling. I mean, it's a good feeling, but it's
Isn't it
kind of
really?
crazy. Yeah. It's wild. You mentioned you went to grad school in Montana. Had you spent much time out west before that? I mean, did you go to Montana obviously for the great writing program, but was it also for the outdoor stuff as well?
Yeah, I did. I'd spent in the winter of 94, winter of 94, 95, I came out and spent a couple weeks in Bozeman. And then starting in the summer of 95, I worked summer jobs in Bozeman. And I had actually started guiding before I went to grad school.
Mm-hmm.
So I was guiding out of a little town called Twin Bridges that many people know probably for Winston fly rods.
Yeah.
And that's where I started out. So it was the Missoula connection was a natural one. I had other opportunities in less fishier environs, but I declined them, because Montana was by then already very much home for me.
Were you, did you have an interest in the Rockies as a kid in Michigan, or did that develop later on? Or when did you kind of get focused in on that area as somewhere you thought you might want to be eventually?
Well, I want to say junior year, I had a good buddy, two of my dear friends, and I took the train from Lansing to Denver, and then caught a ride with our buddy's uncle who was on ski patrol at Breckenridge, and we skied for 3 days. So that was my first, fall in love with the Rockies moment. But that's probably the year after that.
Uh-huh.
I get it mixed up a little bit, but I had this wonderful English teacher who I mentioned to you, Jim Calando, hand me a copy of A River Runs Through It. And,
wow.
I dabbled in writing, barely. It was maybe safe ground for me in an otherwise tumultuous academic life, like I could write a 5-paragraph essay is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But he handed me that book and I was completely transported. It was, I like to self-mythologize a little bit about it, but it was very much a transformative experience. I read it in a day. I'd never read an adult book cover to cover like that. I probably hadn't read anything cover to cover other than some Hook and Bullet magazine or books,
Yeah.
But that was, it was the impetus for me wanting to go west, number one. But B, and probably more importantly, it was I was instantly charged with the notion, or really the command, that I had to attempt to be a writer at that point. Because,
really?
Yeah, I had fished a lot. I love to fish. It was, other than sports, which I loved and was okay at, fishing was something transcendent for me. Now, when I say that, I don't want to give people the wrong impression. I lived in East Lansing, Michigan, and our home water was the Red Cedar, which was this polluted tributary of the Grand River that ran through Michigan State's campus. And, it had smallmouth bass and pike and rock bass in it, and the occasional salmon in the fall would run up from the Great Lakes, from Lake Michigan. But nonetheless, regardless of its uncleanliness, it was still a transporting thing for me to be able to fish like that. And so, we all have those sensations in life, whether it's, an encounter with a person, a loved one, a stranger, food, wine, in this sense, like the wilderness, that when we see them articulated in language, the written word,
Yep.
there's suddenly becomes this transformative experience. So that for me is what, it happened. And I like to tell the story that it happened in a day, maybe it happened in a week, but regardless, at that moment I thought, okay, this is something I have to attempt, and it's a wonderful feeling to be inspired like that. But over time, it becomes a bit of it's a charge, it becomes a vocation. It's a calling. It's like, someone like Juanita, who you mentioned earlier, she's an incredible conservationist and steward of the land.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So that's her calling. It's her vocation. She doesn't just get to enjoy the landscape, right? She's not a tourist. And so she not only enjoys the landscape, but there's some part of her brain that's burning at her to, all right, what do I need to do to make sure this is sustained for the next generation and the next? And so I think it's important for artists, it's important for everybody to really recognize what was that moment that you experienced, a sort of, slap on the face and said, okay, wake up, you got to do something here.
I think that's such you put that perfectly. And I think it can be applied, obviously to art, but really just whatever you decide to devote your career to.
Right.
Because my background before I started doing conservation full time is business. And I went to, I studied econ in undergrad, and then I got an MBA in finance. And so just this endless focus on business. And a lot of the people that I worked with, nothing against them. Everybody needs to make a living, but the goal was, I got to make money. I want to make as much money as possible, and I want to do corporate finance. Well, what kind of company do you want to work at? Well, I don't care. I just want to do corporate finance. And
Right.
and so, when you've got this calling, like you had the writing, and I've come to realize that what I am passionate about is conservation. It is this, in a way, it's kind of like a curse and a blessing at the same time, because you have this burning idea, like, I got to get this done. This is really important, and you can't really coast. But I think the alternative to that is just kind of cruising along and collecting a paycheck. And so personally, I'd rather have the stress and kind of the waking up in the middle of the night thinking about it because I give a shit, versus just, all right, I made a little more money this year than I did last year now, so that's goal completed. Does that make any sense?
It makes a world of sense. Yeah, I think it's it's a conscious decision, and I think you wouldn't have it any other way, right?
Oh yeah, no, definitely not. And in a lot of ways, for me, I mean, you figured it out earlier than I did, but I wish I'd figured this shit out a while back. Sorry for my language, but I get fired up about it because it just makes everything so much more rich, and it can make it more stressful and all that. But at the end, the experience is richer. And I think I had plenty of times leading up to now where I probably had that spark that if I had examined it closely, it may have made me change my direction at age 25 or age 30 or age 35. But I think it just took a while for me to realize that spark was firing off in my brain, whereas you saw it earlier on. But I think people just need to be aware that it's not just a one-time thing, and it's just a happenstance. I mean, I think those sparks, if you're meant to be doing something, those sparks are happening all the time.
They'll keep hollering at you, like your buddy you were mentioning from North Carolina.
Yeah. That's exactly right. So back to your writing for a little bit. I'm always interested in artists and their routines and how they crank out this creative work. It seems like there's a mix on this podcast of a certain amount, probably the majority, treat it almost like they're working at a factory. They clock in, they sit down at the desk or at the easel, and they crank it out daily. And then there's a smaller percentage, but that kind of do it as mood or as inspiration strikes. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
Well, I fall most often with the former. I have to do it every day. I'm very much a momentum oriented writer. you know, if I take a couple weeks off for whatever reason, and then I pick up something I've been working on, it seems incredibly distant to me, you know, a very, very long lost relative. But if I'm working on a piece of work every day, it seems a little more like a continual conversation. Yeah. So I depend on that. And I try to work every day. I've been more and more, you know, with kiddos, you end up taking time off on the weekends to ski or go to basketball or soccer games or track meets and stuff like that. And that used to bother me a lot. I would have this angst over it, you know, and now I'm like, no, I'm going to enjoy this Saturday. We're going to make French toast and play blackjack and go skiing. And I'm not going to feel guilty about it. Like I've lost some, you know, super valuable time at the desk. But it is very important to me to work every day or at least 5 days a week. And the longer the project I'm working on, you know, right now I'm working on a new book of nonfiction, the longer periods of time that I need. So 6-8 hours a day is not too much to ask. My brain seems to really shut down after that.
Yeah.
I have some, you know, there's little tricks. I think like, I can work pretty steadily until 2 p.m, and then I'll fizzle out a little bit, and I can either take like a 10-minute nap with the dog, or I can have an espresso or something like that, and then as a friend of mine says, like, then you kind of fizzle out again around 5. But if you give yourself a couple glasses of wine, you can push through another page or two. So, you know, there's all these little healthy stimulants, if you will. But I feel like if I'm working every day or almost every day, it's much more beneficial to me. I'm not a very, I think Rodin said, I can't believe in inspiration, you know, like I just have to be there every day. And for me, that's the way it works. I wish I could just take 2 months off and then come fix everything that was wrong with my draft, but it doesn't work for me that way.
Where, like physically, where do you write? Do you have a certain room in your house, or do you have, where is the spot?
I've got this sweet little, I got a sweet little studio. A couple years ago, I was fortunate enough to meet a buddy in town who was building these little spec studios, you know?
Yeah.
It's a 10 by 12. It's just maybe 20 feet from my house. The path is under 3 feet of snow today after this blizzard we've had. But yeah, it's just 20 feet from the house. It's got a little electric heat, cedar ceiling and fir floors, all rehabbed from jobs this guy was working on, and he, you know, threw a aluminum roof on it and some siding and shimmed it real tight so that it stays. Once I heat it up in the morning with a little space heater, it stays warm all day.
That's awesome.
And it's fantastic to be able to get just 20 feet away from the house. You know, when I used to work in the basement, part of the issue was our floors were the ceiling downstairs, you know.
Oh, and that's how my basement is, man. That's the same challenge. The reason I ask you all these questions is completely self-serving because I'm trying to figure this out for myself. So I keep going.
I would say it's worth. You know, I can't. My wife Mary always jokes that I can't tell a screwdriver from a hammer, and that's true. But I would say it's worth every cent to get a little space outside of the house, because, you know, the kids, if they know if you're out there that, hey, you're out there, and they can make themselves a sandwich or whatever. And when you're downstairs and you hear them hollering or crying or something or whatever, not that they do that a lot, but you feel guilty if you're not up there helping, right?
I agree.
So
100%.
Yeah. So I think that there's a lovely little disconnect that happens in that 20 feet between the back porch and the space. And also it's sweet. This is my friend Caleb Casper. He has a company called Brome Designs in Missoula, and he just did this amazing job. He built the desk in tight. He built me a little loft bunk, and the girls will come up there when they're home from school and read, or if they're homesick, they can sit up there and watch movies while I work. And I love it. It's one of my favorite parts of the house, and it's not even part of the house.
That's awesome to hear, because like I've really been struggling with any of these little projects I have. The podcast, obviously I need quiet for that, but then just there's some writing projects that I'm working on that I'm going to ask you about after we quit recording.
Yeah.
But
so are you downstairs now?
Yeah, in the basement, and it's loud and same thing. I feel like I should be up there helping and this and that. And so we've got a shed in the backyard, and I think I'm going to finish it out. Just, put some insulation in it, put some plywood on the walls, and that'll be a spot for all my books too, because the books are getting completely out of control. Because now people send me books for free because of this podcast. And my wife's like, all right, this is getting really out of control. And she's so patient and so great, and she puts up with me. But the books need their own spot as well. So it's all right, we'll talk more about this because I might need some specs.
Yeah, man. You got it.
And one other thing, the reason I asked that is because when I was looking up some stuff about you online, I saw something and you had mentioned a shack where you did some writing. And that term is funny because that term has come up several times. David Gessner, who we were talking about before we started recording, who I had on the podcast, who's awesome. He's got a writing shack. And then Hampton Sides, who I've had on the podcast twice, he's got a shack. It sounds like his shack might be more for like drinking bourbon and listening to music. But I think that seems to be the common theme with you writers, is having a separate space where you can just get in there and just crank it out. Pretty cool.
Yeah. And I even go so far as like, let's say I have a day where I've got to do a bunch of desk work, answer a bunch of emails, do some administrative stuff for this Beargrass conference, or, promote a book or something like that. I won't even do it out in the shack. Really? No, I just do it on the kitchen table because like many sportsmen and outdoors people, I would assume, I'm superstitious about that stuff. I don't want that, all that garbage energy in the field and the energy field, if you will.
I get that. I completely get that. You don't want to contaminate it with all that junk. No. I mean, it's a creative space, almost like a dojo, when you go in there, it's time to get to work and it's not for messing around. And have you ever read The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield?
No, I've never read that. I'm writing it down right now, though.
Oh man, you will love it. You don't need it, but for somebody like me, it is amazing, and it's all about that kind of idea about just approaching your work with this as a practice, and fighting what he calls the resistance, which is this urge to do anything except the work you're supposed to do. And
man, it's incredible how tempting it is to give into that stuff.
Is it for you now at this point? Like, is it still a struggle when you go in there, like, oh, well, I want to play with my phone, or I need to?
No, I don't bring my phone in there, but what'll happen is I'll work for a couple hours, and then I'll come in and I'll say, all right, I'm going to make myself a cup of tea, or I'll have lunch, and then I'll say, all right, well, let's fiddle around on Instagram and see what Ed's got going on, and then you're just down that rabbit hole. I think I sent my buddy a video the other day. I can't remember. It was this ridiculous European hunting video where this goofball tries to shoot a pheasant with a bow and arrow, and then he wings it, but he doesn't kill it, and he's running after it trying to throw his bow at the pheasant, you know. And I know, just a complete idiot. So I sent it to my buddy who's a hunting partner of mine, and he said, "You must have been farther down the Instagram rabbit hole than you've ever been to." And it was, you know, he had it right. You know, that wasn't the first sweep that uncovered that. So yeah, I do feel, I mean, I don't think it says anything about a lack of love or passion for the work, but it just says something about how distractible my brain is right now, you know? And I, you know, I find, like, in the middle of hunting season, I bird hunt a lot. I have an amazing, lovely male English setter named Zeke who takes me all over the hills and such for upland birds. And, you know, I find like my concentration that time of year is at its peak, you know, after, when I'm in the middle of that kind of season. I can come back to the desk and feel really clear-headed about things, you know. And the only thing I can do in the winter to feel similarly is maybe a day skiing, or I do a lot of hot yoga, Bikram yoga.
Oh yeah, that stuff's good stuff.
Yeah, it's great, and that tends to burn off that monkey brain, you know, the one that won't get you going back to the television of your phone.
Oh yeah, the baby television in our pocket. That's exactly right.
But, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, but you know, I don't want to come off as, I don't want to imply that it's all bad, because it's not. Like you and I were saying beforehand, aside from the fact that you started the podcast so that your wife would actually listen to you, really wonderful people are engaged on social media all the time. And so it just takes a little more discipline than I'm able to provide most of the time, I think, you know?
Well, and you got to remember that Facebook, who owns Instagram, has teams and teams and teams of very highly paid psychologists figuring out how to make that stuff addictive as possible. So, I mean, if you can control it a little bit, that's better than most. But I think there is a lot of good that comes out of it. I mean, me and you connected because of it. So that's awesome. Yeah. And so it's like any tool. It just needs to be used for a specific purpose. So one more question, then I'll probably have a lot more. One more question about writing. When you put out a poem or a book and you've put your heart and your soul into it, and I would imagine with all, but especially with poetry, I mean, it seems like there's something, you're kind of exposing yourself and your inner thoughts, and it's an intimate kind of look into your brain. So when you put something like that out, is there self-doubt that comes into your mind? And if so, or almost like concern that people are going to be judging it, or how is this going to be received? And I would imagine that's probably the case with the book, because you're going to be getting reviews. Is there like self-doubt that needs to be overcome for that? And if so, have you figured out over your career some techniques for getting past that? Again, I'm asking for a friend, not for myself.
Yeah, man, that's a great question. It's funny when you ask it, the obvious answer to me is yes. There is. I don't think I'm interested in writing anything that doesn't risk some level of emotion, feeling, even sentimentality. I don't want to be a sentimental writer, but I think, as William Kittredge said, if a writer's not risking sentimentality, then or risking emotional vulnerability, then there's really I have no interest in it, So there is, I mean, several of the poems in my second book of poems, this book called Earth Again, were all of them were, but several of them were, how do I say this? There was a certain level of intimacy to them, physical intimacy,
sure,
depicted and such. And at the time, I remember not being at all bothered by that. One thing the poet can always hide behind is the quote construct of the I, the first person I, that the I is not, the I in the poem is not the author, right? And Yeats talked about this. He said, look, I'm never the same person when I sit down to write as I am when I'm taking my tea and eating my oats, or something to that extent, know. And anybody who's written enough would agree, I think, with that. But man, nowadays I look back and I'm thinking, what are my kids going to think when they read this? But at the same time, so I have, I'm probably, more interested in talking about Body of Water, A, because I know you just read it, and B, because people run, rightly so, when they hear folks talking about poetry. But I wrote I have a new book of poems coming out called Ragged Anthem, and it is it's very much I call it it delves a very difficult 3-year period in my life, and it's very dark in places,
Really?
But I feel like it is, to use a phrase a friend used to describe it, it's a record of deliverance, if you will. And so it's an important record, I think, because people, I hope, will encounter it, and if they are or have experienced some level of, emotional trauma in their life, then it will help them through that. But it will only help them if it, again, risks some level of emotional vulnerability, right?
Sure.
So the answer to your question is yes. I don't feel a lot of self-doubt about the quality of the work, because I've worked as hard as I can on those poems, right? Not to say that they're perfect or anything like that. I just mean, I probably if the book's 70 pages, each of those poems saw 30 some drafts.
Wow.
And that's, at some point you have to put it aside and go, that's the best I can do. So I don't feel any level of, I feel that, there's a level of rigor to them, and I've done my best on a technical level. But as far as like, I'm going to get up and read these poems to people, yeah, I do. I feel that. And more and more I'm less interested in reading poems to an academic audience,
Really?
I'm way more interested in reading them to audiences who wouldn't normally encounter poetry. I've got a real good friend. He's probably my first reader. He's a singer-songwriter out of Massachusetts named Jeffrey Foucault. He plays. He comes through the West quite a bit. But a few years ago, he convinced me, when this last book, Earth Again, was out, to get up on stage with him a couple times during his shows, and read with he and his drummer Billy Conway, like, backing me acoustically.
Cool.
And that was a super frightening experience, but really rewarding as well, because I was able to read poems to people who, wouldn't necessarily show up at a bookstore on a Wednesday night, or at the university lecture hall or something like that to hear poems read. So, well,
that takes me to a question I wanted to ask you about poetry, because, like I said, I really don't know anything about it, and I'm going to get your books. But if I wanted to poetry 101 and wanted to start reading it, how would you recommend I go about that? Like, what poets should I look at that are somewhat user friendly, and what should I be looking for when I read them? Because I've asked that question before to somebody on the podcast and didn't really get that much of a specific answer.
Yeah.
And I understand it's not just like a black and white thing, like a math problem or something, but what's the entry point into poetry?
I think the entry point is the opposite of the way we're asked to enter it from an early age, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way we're often asked as a middle school or a high school or even an undergrad is to say, what's the meaning of this poem, right? What does it mean? And we've gotten away from that a little bit in pedagogically, but that's the wrong way to go about it. Like, what's a mountainside blooming in 7 different species of wildflowers backed by a grand peak and snowfield club covered in cloud shadow? What does that mean? You're not searching for meaning there. You're searching for experience, right?
Sure.
What do I experience when I engage with the poem? So I think, thinking of poetry in terms of like, how would you engage with a glass of wine, right? Mm-hmm. Or how would you engage with a jazz composition, say by Dexter Gordon, right? Or Miles Davis or Coltrane or anybody like that. When you start listening to jazz, you pick up on little things. You say, okay, I can hear the bass there. I'm going to follow the bass for a little while, right? Or a glass of wine, like, God, I think I taste some, a little bit of tobacco in there. What is that? Or a little spice, right? So as you spend more time with poetry, you start to, okay, I'm going to read this poem for the rhythm, right? The next time I read it, I'm going to read it for the image. The next time I'm going to read it for the cadences that the syntax kind of teases out. And then maybe by the 4th or 5th time, I'm going to read it all, and all of that is going to kind of join into some unified experience. Because I do think experience is really what we're looking for. And also, poetry is a tough genre to engage with because it forces us to slow down.
Sure.
And as you were saying earlier, to ponder each syllable, each word, each image, the entire visual package of it. All of these elements play a role in how we experience it. I like this Gary Snyder definition. He says, poetry is the skilled and inspired use of the voice and language to embody rare and powerful states of mind that are in immediate origin, personal to the singer, but at deep levels common to all who listen. And I mean, that sounds a little heady, but it's really not. I think what he's saying is, poetry is at its best. It's a completely unifying genre, right?
Sure.
The poet and the reader can experience, almost the exact precise sense of emotions and feelings and experience if the language is right, So, but it's also a bodily art, it's a spoken art. And so it's probably best read out loud. And we don't do that a whole lot anymore, As you say, you experience it probably first through the syllables. So it's a felt art. And it's crazy, man. You probably just had like 20 people, 30 people, 100 people tune off of the podcast.
No, it doesn't matter because this is only for me. Like if anybody else wants to listen, that's awesome. But very, very selfish project here because it's only for this is what I want to know. So
good.
No, and this sounds kind of crazy, but I think you'll understand what I mean. I've had the experience before where, like with music, if there's music and somebody's singing or whatever in a different language, that you can almost understand that there's something to it beyond the words. Like there's like a deeper level that where the language doesn't actually matter. And so I feel like what you're saying with poetry is you got to read it and look at it from all these different levels to really understand what it is built on, which is beyond language. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a poet like James Galvin, especially for people in the West, I feel like his work is entirely accessible.
Mm-hmm.
Poetry's crazy, man. It really, really is. But it's also for someone like me, it's a part of how I survive as a human being. I love Jim Harrison's work, and I was fortunate enough to call him a really dear friend.
That's amazing.
Yeah, late in his life, and I spent a lot of lovely time with him. But he's someone who, if you think about it, I mean, he published, I want to say, 15 full-length collections of poems. He was still writing poetry until he actually died while he was composing a poem. And
he died while he was composing a poem? Yeah, I didn't know that.
He's writing a poem in Arizona. And there's a lovely elegy to him by Tom McGuane in the New Yorker. He and McGuane were lifelong friends. They were actually born on the same day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. But there's a lovely depiction of that kind of an elegiac depiction of Harrison writing that last poem. But, why Harrison was a world-renowned novelist. He would walk down the street in Paris and people would run up to him with copies of his books in their hand and ask him to, autograph them. And he was a beloved author, novelist, and prose writer. And, why would he keep writing poetry? Because he had to, it was essential to his way of survival. And I think a poem says what nothing else can, mm-hmm. in a way that only a poem can, and that's why we keep digging at them, I think, because as poets, we think, I'd say this another way if I could, but the only way I can do it is here in counted syllables and measured lines and all that stuff. The poet Christian Wyman, who edited Poetry Magazine for a long time and now teaches at Yale Divinity School, he has a great essay called A Piece of Prose, mm-hmm. And he's talking about the difference between poetry and prose, and he references a line by Robinson Jeffers, a poet who lived out on the California coast in Big Sur, and Jeffers says, "I can lie in prose," and you can, you
sure.
But poetry sits the poet down on the blank page, against the silence, and says, "Okay, what do you have to say here?" And if it's not honest emotionally, or if it's not linguistically rigorous enough, then it stands out, right?
Sure.
So I don't know, man. It's crazy. I look at it every now and then and think, what in God's name, why would anyone subject themselves to this? But
that's, again, man, that's why, I mean, it may be easier to not have your life so wrapped up in that, but it would be boring, man. I mean, you're obsessed with it. I love hearing it. And I mean, it's what gives one of the many things that gives your life meaning, and you don't have a choice, Right. I love it. So I'll put links. You said your new one is called Ragged Anthem. Is that correct?
Yeah, Ragged Anthem.
And what are the other ones called? I'll put links to everything on the notes,
sure.
So people can buy
them. Ragged Anthem is the new one. It's coming out this spring, and then Earth Again is my second book of poems. And going back any further than that would get you into material that I'm not comfortable talking about.
Yeah. Well, I'll put links to all those because, I mean, talking about where should people start? I mean, I think people who've listened to this and heard your story and kind of see how your brain works, I feel like if you've never read poetry, this is as good a place to start as any, because now you got this background. And so that's where I'm going to start.
I'm excited too. There's actually 3 or 4 hunting poems in this book.
Cool.
Yeah, there's several. There's one where my son Luca is an incredible runner. He's blazing fast, and there was one day around Christmas where I asked him to go out and clean this pheasant I had shot like a couple days before I was cooking Christmas dinner, and we'd given him a knife for Christmas.
Yeah.
And so I said, can you go out there? And I had already had plans to make stock out of everything but the legs and the breasts.
Sure.
And so I said, he knows how to clean a bird. I said, can you breast it out and cut the legs off? And he came back in with 2 breasts on a plate, and he said, as a runner, I cannot cut the legs off of another. And he's a tough kid, he's very much a hunter and whatnot. But so, those are the kinds of questions that we can engage with in poetry. But again, I think the first question you asked is, how do you approach it? And I think poetry doesn't have to give us answers to questions. Really, it's probably best thought of as something that forms questions nothing else could ask, right? No other genre or art could ask. And so it often asks us to kind of remain in a state of what Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainties without any grasping after fact or reason. And that mystery, that level of maybe there's something here that I don't know, which, back to what you were saying about turning 40, I think part of, entering middle age is coming to terms with all we don't know, right?
That's exactly. Sorry to interrupt, but I had to say that, you said that it's not about finding the answer, but I feel like the answer is there is no answer. Right.
Yeah. I forget who said it, but one poet said, "My wisdom is the accumulation of all that I do not know." Basically, there's so much out there that remains a mystery to us. And I think good poetry keeps engaging with that sense of mystery and that sense of approaching the world with a vulnerability,
Yes.
Again, back to that notion, I can lie in prose. If you're lying on the poetry page, if you're faking it, it's so easy to notice because people are paying attention to so carefully to the language you're using. That's why my wife Mary likes podcasts so much, and she said, whatever you do, be honest, because people can tell when you're not, right?
Oh yeah, definitely can. It's no BS because we talk for so long. If you're doing some TV show or something, it's 5-10 minutes edited down. Whereas on these things, you dig into the details, which is exactly why I loved listening and why I decided I wanted to start one. And you can sniff out real quick if somebody's full of it or not, or at least I feel like I can.
Yeah. Have you ever not to sidetrack here, but have you ever gotten in one of those conversations and you thought, oh man, this is not going to go well?
Surprisingly, on this podcast, I've yet to have what I would consider a dud. I mean, there've been different personalities and different outlooks and all that, but I mean, I feel like if people are willing to be honest, it doesn't matter if they're doing work that I would consider boring or their hobbies that have nothing. We have no overlap in our interest. I feel like if somebody's willing to be honest, I can generally find something that I would consider interesting. And so I guess just through through luck, really, because I don't know a lot of these people I get on the podcast. I've just ended up having a lot of people who are willing to be honest, and so the conversations are genuine, and it's really cool because in this world of social media and stuff being surface level and kind of BS, and to be able to have these in-depth conversations with people that most of whom I don't know, it's really, really, it's awesome. I love it. And other people seem to love it. So that's cool.
Yeah, it is. It's a fantastic conduit, really, for conversation. And again, I mean, back to the social media world, I see a lot of amazing stuff happening, inspiring stuff happening, or at least inspiring people connecting on social media.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like a lot of this podcast is a result of social media. So I need to quit just giving it this blanket bashing, because that goes back to, the answer is there is no answer. There's no right or wrong. It's all gray. And so it's really, like you and I wouldn't be talking, Juanita and I wouldn't have talked. I mean, it's a great tool for that. And, it's all been, this whole podcast thing has just blown my mind. But it's been awesome. So I can't believe this. I just looked at the clock and we're at 1 hour and 10 minutes and I feel like we just started. It's just awesome. That means it's good. But I want to respect your time because I know you got a lot going on. And if I'm up in Montana this summer, we'll do a part 2 because in person.
That's awesome.
But can I run through some of these quick questions I have that I ask everybody at the end?
Let's do rapid fire.
Sweet. So what are your favorite books related to the West? 1 or 2 that come to mind as just being kind of the best?
Oh, man.
It's hard.
You squeezed me when you said related to the West there. I don't ever go very far without the poetry of James Galvin, which I've mentioned, I think is kind of seminal to the West.
Sure.
An old classic that I think people should not forget about is Gretel Ehrlich's The Solace of Open Spaces, which is a lovely collection of essays really about, and actually more prescient than ever, probably, with the kind of endangerment of open spaces that we see happening across the West. Man, I just read a novel that is, well, Harrison once said that the New York publishing industry thought of everything west of the East River as regional literature. So I'll take that little line and go with a novel I just read by a late novelist named Richard Wagamese. He wrote an incredible novel called Indian Horse, which is also published by Milkweed. And it's a book about a young, you want me to describe it? Or
yeah, I want to hear about it. Yeah. Okay.
So it's a book about a young man, a young native boy, whose family is broken up by the early Jesuit missionaries to Manitoba. I hope I'm getting that province right. In the 20s, I'm terrible with history, but basically his sister gets kidnapped by missionaries. His brother gets abducted, basically, and taken to a school. His parents fall under the spell of the bottle, and his grandmother tries to kind of resurrect what remains of the family by taking them to this place called God's Lake, which is his great grandfather's ancient native ground, right?
Yeah.
So this will sound small or kind of smart, but hijinks ensue, right? And the family breaks up, and the grandmother takes him basically back to civilization, where he ends up at this brutal Indian reservation school. The only saving grace of which is that Saul, who's the main character, learns to play hockey there. And he learns basically by, shuffling frozen horse turds around on this ice rink.
Yeah.
And and he basically is incredibly gifted at it, and earns his way out of this super traumatic place. So that's his, I'm only 50 pages in there in my description, but it's a tremendous novel, told with such courage and emotional clarity. And in many ways it's like, it's uplifting. And in other ways it's tragic, but it's just as good as novels get. It's a short 260 page novel. I think I never look any farther than Tom McGuane for great novels or short stories about the West. I remember picking up Gallatin. I'd read everything by McGuane, but I remember picking up Gallatin Canyon, which was a collection of stories that came out probably 10 or so years ago.
Yeah, I remember when that came out because I think I lived in Wyoming and I used to drive through Gallatin Canyon all the time, but I haven't read it.
Heading up into Montana, and I'd written a lot of short stories as an undergrad, and I was thinking maybe I'll get back into to writing short stories, and I read Gallatin Canyon straight through, and I thought, nope, I'm never going to try. This is just way too good, So, I mean, I love McGuane's work, and I think he's certainly one of our best prose writers, prose stylists, if not our best in the country. And that's not even mentioning his fishing essays or his hunting essays, like the ones that are in Outside Chance or The Longest Silence. There's nothing even approaching those. I did just read a book too. If you're looking for future podcast guests, there's a writer from Missoula, this guy named Bryce Andrews, who's written a wonderful nonfiction book called Down from the Mountain about the grizzly bears on the Mission, coming out of the Mission Range north of us in towns like St. Ignatius.
Yeah. I know that area.
And Ronan, and it's a fascinating study about how it follows the life of this one grizzly bear. And really exposes some of the disservices we're doing to this large predator, namely by planting corn, which is essentially the equivalent of, Big Macs to large predators like grizzlies. They get into the corn and they just can't stop eating it. Right. And yet it has little or no nutritional value. They're not expending any energy to forage it. Right. And so they just end up sitting. Their teeth decay. They won't move until a combine is within like 20 feet of them or something like that. So it's an awesome study on how we're engaging with the wildest members of our non-human community, I guess I would call it.
That sounds really interesting, and I've never really read a book really about bears. I read one recently just about wolves that was super interesting, but that one sounds good. And then I always need fiction recommendations because as people who listen to this thing know, for some reason I have such a hard time reading fiction. I don't do it. But whenever I find a good one, it always makes me regret how little I do read fiction. So all those were perfect recommendations. So I'll have links to all that stuff. That's awesome.
Cool.
This is kind of about your fishing life. I'm not asking for specific spots, obviously, but is there a specific river in the West that you absolutely love that you would say is your favorite river?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guide on the Bitterroot, Rock Creek, the Clark Fork, and the Blackfoot. Those are all rivers that come right into Missoula. Basically, the confluences of those rivers all occur within stone's throw of Missoula. so they're all favorites at different times of the year, you know, and,
sure.
But if I get out of that, that kind of home water list, then I love the Big Hole.
I love the Big Hole. That's probably my favorite place in Montana. I love it.
Isn't it wonderful? It's so, you know, distinct. It runs through such disparate country. You know, there's that kind of alpine meadow stuff on the higher end, and then you go through the canyon, and then you get into the bottomland. And we used to do a lot of overnight family floats on it.
Sure.
You know, on the lower end, and I love it. And I'm fortunate to have a real good buddy who still guides down there, so I get a lot of pictures and stories from it. And yeah, it's a wild river. It's wonderful.
Yeah, that whole area is just beautiful. That was one of the first places I ever fished when I moved out west, and I think it'll always have a special place. I need to get back up there. So next to the last question, knowing everything you know about the West, all the time you've spent outdoors and on rivers and writing and thinking about the West, if you could make a request or maybe offer some words of wisdom to people that listen to this podcast, and it's just people who love the West in one way or the other, just like me and you, in different ways, you know, some through athletics, some through fishing, hunting, conservation, ranching. If you could offer them some wisdom or ask them to do something, take some action, does anything come to mind?
You know, I stumbled on something the other day. You were asking about good films, and Steve Ranella was in town in Missoula for the Missoula Doc Fest, and I got to see his new documentary. I think it's called Stars in the Sky.
Uh-huh.
It's just out. I want to say it premiered here, but it's you know, in keeping with everything those guys do at Meat Eater. It was fantastic, but I had forgotten that Teddy Roosevelt was guided when he came out and shot those first two bison, right?
Yep.
And I thought to myself, man, and now no one out there can steal this, okay? Because I might use this someday in an article or what. But I thought to myself, what a fantastic tiny hero in American history. Not Teddy, obviously, to whom we owe a great amount of thanks. But what about that guide, right?
Oh, yeah.
Who essentially was the conduit to inspire these great acts of conservation.
Sure.
And so I thought to myself, you know, it's not all bad to be a boat jockey for 20 years as
sure.
I have. You know, somewhere along the line, it stands to reason that we might be that person who helps someone else encounter wild places, rivers, fish, game, landscape in such a way that they can make a sweeping change that we as an individual might not be able to, right?
Yep.
And so that's, I guess, what I would say is I was inspired by that guide in the story, because even though I have a wonderful relationship with most of my clients, many of whom are friends, I've been guiding them for 15 or 20 years, there are still plenty of days when it's work, right? You know,
yeah.
You gotta get up, you got to get lunch ready, you got to clean the boat, you got to gas up, you got to make sure you're not going to fight with your old enemy at the put in or something like that. And so I was inspired by that film anyway, in that moment where they shine a tiny little light on Teddy's guide. And I thought, you know, we can all be that person in the West. We can all, whether we have visitors, or whether we have a career in the, in the outdoor rec industry, whatever, we can all be that person who not only stewards and appreciates the land, but maybe serves as that link to someone who says, holy smokes, man, I didn't know this was out here. We have to save it. We have to preserve it.
I think that's great. And I've never thought about it in that way, but that's true. I mean, to want to protect these places, you have to love the places, and to love the places, you need to get out in them and guides are the way that happens, whether it's fishing guides or, a NOLS instructor or, any
Right.
outward bound instructor. I mean, it's those people that introduce you to it that is that first spark, So I think that's awesome, man. That's a really good way to wrap it up. So how can people connect with you? Obviously, I'll have links to all your books, and then the social media we keep talking about. How can they find you on there?
I've already confessed I'm a rabid social media. I really only got an Instagram account like 2 months ago or something like that. But Instagram is great. I have a webpage that's Dombrowski.com. And those are great ways. My email's on my webpage too. Anyway, I love hearing from people.
Yeah, you were responsive to me just out of the blue, so I appreciate it, man. This was really, really cool, and I feel like we got a lot more to talk about. But thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Really appreciate it.
Oh, you're so welcome, Ed, and I love what you're doing, and I'm excited. I want you to get up here this summer. We can do a little river edition.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast, and thanks for listening to that particular episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Before you go, I've got 3 quick things. Number 1, if you like the podcast, please do me a huge favor. Either pass it along to a friend who may be interested, share it on your social media, or go to iTunes and give it a 5-star review. All those things would mean a lot to me, and they would really help to spread the word about the podcast. Number 2, if you've listened to many of these episodes, you know that I love reading and I love talking about books. Every other month, I send out a quick email with a few books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The subjects are varied, but they're pretty much all nonfiction with an emphasis on history, biographies, adventure narratives, and topics related to the American West. There are no sales pitches for ranches, no spam, no other kind of nonsense, just books. So if you'd like to sign up for the list, head to Mountain and Prairie/reading, or just go to Mountain and Prairie and there's a massive tab at the top that says book recommendations. Click on it. There are a ton of good books that I've read. Some of the old email lists are on there. You can go crazy. There are a lot of books. And finally, if you know anyone I should interview for the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. All my contact info is at mountainandprairie.com, and I'm on all the social media stuff, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, blah, blah, blah. So feel free to reach out. I'd love to have some recommendations and suggestions of interesting people I should meet. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.